Castlevania Circle of the Moon, or as it's known in Europe, Castlevania, is the only Igavania game in the franchise with no involvement by Igarashi. Instead, it was made by the same development team that brought you classics like Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness. Circle is lacking the distinctive art style of Ayami Kojima, the unique sound of Michiru Yamane, and the philosophy or direction of Koji Igarashi, leading Circle of the Moon to be a black sheep of sorts, my overall impression sitting in the middle of the road. Granted, this game has gained a reputation as an overlooked gem, despite rave reviews at its launch. History has forgotten about this game in comparison to other Igavanias. However, there is a lack of discussion about where Circle of the Moon fails, in comparison to what came before or even after. Immediate improvements from Symphony of the Night make themselves apparent by simply looking at the map screen itself. While still effectively the same looking screen, the map is far more willing to fill itself in without the player needing to cling to walls for the completion rate. Dying in Circle of the Moon is far less punishing than its predecessor. Nathan's death animation is much shorter, the game over screen displays almost instantly, and as soon as you hit the continue, you are back in the save point. A merciful improvement. Nathan, despite not being a Belmont, has inherited Richter's sliding attack as well as his own unique whip spin ability, as opposed to the manual whip control from previous games. An incredibly handy skill when dealing with the smaller, hard-to-hit flying enemies. Circle of the Moon's sprite work is rather impressive for a launch title on the Game Boy Advance. The animations are subpar, however the backgrounds have a surprising amount of detail. The true star of the game's visuals are the bosses. Much like Castlevanias of the past, many of these sprites are large and carry a lot of detail to them. The dragon zombie stands out the most and comes the closest to Symphony of the Night's beautiful boss design. Despite Michiru Yamane's absence, the soundtrack for Circle still manages to provide some quality songs. Awake is notably the standout original track for this game, and you can't go wrong with revisiting some of the classics such as Vampire Killer or Dance of Illusions. Circle of the Moon's most notable mechanic is the dual setup system, which involves obtaining cards to either enhance an action or an attribute within the game. By pairing cards together, Nathan gets access to a new ability or enhancement that uses up his mana bar. There's around 80 combinations, and while this is an interesting idea in theory, the sad truth is that this means grinding on very specific enemies until you get the card you want from them, and the odds of these cards dropping do not feel very much in the player's favour. The card system is also more limiting in game than Symphony of the Night. In Symphony of the Night, you could have a familiar summoned, use a magic spell, attack with an elemental weapon, then change forms, all in one swift sequence. In Circle, all these types of abilities limit the player to one card pairing at a time, meaning you have to choose between that fire whip or your familiar, rather than having both, which cripples the flow of the game, making so much of the game stop and start. Any player who was not a fan of Symphony of the Night's more flexible difficulty will be pleased to know the challenge in Circle of the Moon is downright spiteful. One of the earliest things a player is likely to notice when beginning this game is just how rare it is for an enemy to drop a health potion, or any curative items for that matter, meaning unless you're willing to run back to save rooms often, you're in for a rough time. If an enemy isn't throwing some kind of projectile at you, they're large enough to make jumping over them a challenge in and of itself. Enemies that spawn regularly, such as the zombie or mummy, take so many hits to kill that you can find yourself stuck in a situation of standing still or spamming your attacks, very slowly tiptoeing to the next room. It's strange to find that the infamous Medusa heads are somehow some of the more manageable enemies in the entire game. And unfortunately, your only real solution to most of these woes is to grind levels out enough that enemies stop becoming a problem. Gear is a lot less frequent than it once was, and very few equipable items are on the same level of power than gear you may find in Symphony of the Night. Players may notice that Circle of the Moon is also lacking in an item shop of any kind, meaning that all equipment, abilities, items and cards must be picked up from enemies that drop them. While there are other weapons in the game, they are only accessible via the card system. The main thing you will find yourself doing in this game is repeatedly attacking the same group of enemies in the hopes that they will drop the item or gear you so desperately need to reduce the challenge. Unlike Symphony of the Night, where the focus is in player choice, deciding the difficulty for most of the game, Circle of the Moon's options all revolve around grinding. Circle of the Moon behaves as one of those games where the solution to most of its problems is that you just have to know. And if you don't know, then you're in for an unpleasant experience. You need to know which specific enemies drop specific gear, items or cards, you need to know which card combinations are the most useful throughout the game, you need to know where save rooms are ahead of time as they are the only consistent method of restoring all your health, and you need to know that killing an optional boss makes an area later in the game far easier. Bosses are a key part of any game's design. They are the developer's opportunity to go all out to create a distinctive stamp for a game that can stick with a player years after playing it. They test all the player has learned so far in the game, or as a way to express a certain kind of tension. Some boss fights are memorable for using a unique mechanic.
You like Castlevania, don't you?
While others are memorable purely based on the spectacle of it, even as a way to bookend a certain part of a game, rewarding the player for making it that far. Castlevania Circle of the Moon's boss fights are a failure. It might sound harsh, but it's hard to praise this game's boss fights when even the first one comes across as a huge wall demanding you run back and grind a lot. It is possible to fight these bosses without getting hit. However, the developers haven't thought about this in the same way Symphony of the Night's team did. A typical boss fight in Circle of the Moon will involve a focus on platforms, screen-filling projectiles, and large sprites that take up a lot of screen space and deal a ton of damage. Most, if not all the time, the solution is not to practice an enemy pattern or utilize your gear, but to simply level enough so that you can kill it before it can kill you. This method takes a literal form in the Iron Golem, who has the ability to heal. Nothing you can do stops this healing process. You need to whip stronger than it recovers. What's even more disheartening is that upon defeating a boss, your health does not restore, meaning that you're at a huge risk of dying after defeating a challenging boss before an opportunity to save presents itself. If you die, you'll have to go through the entire process again. This is made worse by Nathan, who moves a lot like a typical Belmont character in the earlier Castlevania games. While this was a purposeful choice to make Circle of the Moon feel more like those older games, it hinders all the other elements of this Igavania-styled game. His walk speed is painfully slow, as is his clunky run. He has a tremendous amount of weight to him, and he makes very little distance during a jump, making platforming feel sluggish. And while in older games the whip feels just right, when you have to deal with enemies that will require multiple hits, you'll be longing for Alucard's sharp sword swings. Even things like a slide felt better when in control of Richter, who was able to barrel across a room with acrobatic ease in Symphony of the Night. Nathan, on the other hand, can't even live up to the likes of Mega Man when it comes to his own sliding motion. This movement style works completely counterintuitive to the more platforming focused level design, which makes the game feel closer to Metroid without any of the grace. Every boss gives Nathan a new ability that unlocks more progression throughout the castle, which is very similar to Samus's progression in the Metroid games. Unlike Metroid or Symphony, the map layout in Circle of the Moon is unique. In most Metroid games, the map layout design always gives the player an idea of where they should be going, not to mention a feeling that they are progressing. When a key item is needed to progress, it's made apparent, reserved for one or two obvious locations so you can keep a cognitive map. When you acquire a new ability, you'll know exactly where to use said ability to progress. Metroid also has the player revisit a core location that connects to all others as a hub world of sorts. It's treated as a momentary intermission for the player as they get their bearings before visiting the next location. If we were to look at the critical path you take in Circle of the Moon, including the optional dragon zombie and death bosses as they make the journey to Camilla easier, we get something like this. So Dracula boots you out of his house because he's upset with you, and you fall down the catacombs all the way to the bottom of the screen for some reason. But you can't run yet because this game's weird, and you have to go through like 4 rooms before you actually can get a pair of boots that let you run. And then once you've gotten the boots that let you run, you gotta run all the way to the right. These are all just unnecessary rooms that you don't really have to visit. You climb up here and then to the left, and then there's all these weird annoying platforms that you gotta go round, and then you kill the Cerberus, and now you have to immediately backtrack because there's just a wall in the way, even though any other game would have put a door there so that you didn't have to do all the... So you walk back around in a circle, and now you have to start climbing upwards. Now you got the double jump, you can like go up to this area, which is strange. You would think that you would go to like an area where Carmilla is or something now, because that would make sense. That would be like a circle or some kind of like statue or lever. And now you can go from the centre corridor. Stop! Don't make maps ever again, please. Please! I hate this game, it's annoying the hell out of me. I'm slowly turning into James Rolfe because of this. While Symphony for the most part takes you in a circle, ironically the game with circle in the name takes you down a wacky maze. Perhaps the map was designed this way in an attempt to lengthen the experience for a first-time player. This may also explain why for some reason you need to find the ability to run as opposed to having it for the first couple of rooms, why they hid Nathan's faster movement speed in the card system, and why so much of this game revolves around grinding enemies. This design method may also explain Circle of the Moon's disappointing New Game Plus modes. You're given no new characters to play as, only stat changes and the ability to start the game with all the cards, making your second run much faster by cutting out so much of the grind. If the idea of grinding through the game blind is unappealing to you, there is one way to alleviate the tedium. A very simple glitch that allows use of any combination of cards you want, thus removing the need to grind, allowing the player to effectively cheat nearly every boss in the game with the use of Pluto and Black Dog, two cards you're unable to gain until far later into a playthrough. While this does objectively remove most of the game's difficulty, it was clearly never what the developers intended for players to do. It's telling of the overall quality of the game if exploitation of a glitch is a method I would recommend to make the experience more enjoyable. You may say I've been unfair on Circle of the Moon comparing it to Symphony of the Night, a game on much more powerful hardware on a less tight schedule. But what came after this game built on top of it in such a way that going back seems archaic, especially when we're currently living in a golden age of Metroidvania style games. If you enjoy this game, more power to you, but from the perspective of someone who had never played this game until recently, I felt a bit underwhelmed, especially since the next game we're covering is one I have a more intimate relationship with. We'll see Igarashi return for a Harmony of Dissonance.